All right, guys, let's continue with chapter 22. This is part 2 video. We just finished up with the Last Supper. Jesus was breaking the bread and drinking the wine for the body and blood representation. And now we're getting into the argument among the disciples about who is the greatest of the entire group. In verse 25, Jesus says, "In this world, the kings and great men lord it over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant." Who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here, for I am among you as the one who serves. Jesus was at that table. He was the most important person there. And so he's demonstrating that, recognizing that he is the most important at the table, he is still choosing to serve. He is still washed feet. He still is doing all these things. That's the posture that we should have. None of this, well, I'm so great or I'm this far advanced, I shouldn't be, lowering myself to these kinds of tasks. Like, I don't get coffee. At some point we all get coffee. But you know what I mean? We need to always have that posture of servanthood. Then he tells them that because they stayed with him, that he is going to give them a place to eat and drink at his table in the kingdom. So I want to break down some of these notes because I thought they were pretty good. The most important event in human history was about to take place, and the disciples were still arguing about their prestige in the kingdom. Looking back, we see that this was no time to worry about status, but the disciples, wrapped up in their own concerns, did not perceive what Jesus had been trying to tell them about his approaching death and resurrection. What are your major concerns today? As you look back 20 years from now, will these worries look petty and inappropriate? Get your eyes off yourself and get ready for Christ coming into human history for the second time. This is me just sharing an opinion about why I love this Bible. There are times that we're reading scripture and there's more to it that we may not grasp right away. And so, reading this note, for example, I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about that, that we're focusing on other things when the most important thing is at hand, and we're so wrapped up in whatever this issue is that's concerning us that we don't even really see to understand what is happening around us. Next one, a world system of leadership is very different from leadership in God's kingdom. Worldly leaders are often selfish and arrogant as they claw their way to the top, but among Christians, the leader is to be the one who serves best. There are different types of leadership. Some lead through public speaking, some through administering, some through relationships, but every Christian leader needs a servant heart. Ask the people you lead how you can serve them better. Another way to illustrate this is looking at what the world considers to be important, things that we should be pursuing and prioritizing, and how vastly different it is from what God is asking of us. The things that are important in this world, worldly ways, is not at all what God considers to be important and where God is asking us to prioritize and put our efforts in. Because when we meet Jesus, he's not going to ask us what level we made in our employment or what car we drove or how old we were when we bought our first home. None of those things matter to him. What matters to him is what we did with what he called us to do. This whole giving the disciples a spot at the table in the kingdom. There's a note here. It says, Jesus gave the disciples great honors and great responsibilities in this passage. The disciples sit with Christ at his table in his kingdom, and they would sit on thrones as judges over Israel. Why did Jesus give them such honorable positions? The only qualification that Luke suggests are in Jesus' words, "You have stayed with me in my time of trial." The disciples had simply stuck it out. Jesus did not recognize their service or their humility or their leadership or their wisdom. They simply stuck with Jesus and persevered. I think that's important for us to pay attention to. Sometimes we like to elevate these disciples to some level that we can't attain, and we could never be a disciple because they're just so great and they've accomplished so much and know so much about the word. And it's like, these are everyday people, and the reason that they were able to have a place at his kingdom to judge over is because they just stuck it out with him, not because they were these overly qualified people. So it goes on to say, we believe that we are saved by grace through faith, but it's easy to think that God's honor roll will list those who accomplished the most for God's kingdom. But the disciples were promised great places in God's kingdom for simply having stayed with Jesus. If you're losing hope in producing something worthwhile for God, or if you're hanging on to God by threads, be encouraged and hold on. Be faithful. Being faithful sometimes simply means staying with Jesus, persevering and sticking it out. When things are just really hard and you don't know how to make it better, how to get out of it, it's just that much of a mess. You feel helpless, and the only one that can come in is God. The fact that you're choosing to stay with God through this and remain faithful, that's what it means to stick with Jesus. It doesn't mean because you did end up having the answers and you were able to have all these things figured out and this, amazing spiritual growth happened that you were cognitively aware of at the time. And if that did happen, then that's great. But I'm just trying to point out that it's not that these disciples were on some pedestal that we can never attain that kind of a level. It was because they chose to stick by Jesus. So now let's get into Peter's betrayal. Verse 31 starts off with, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat. Emphasis on Satan has asked. So just friendly reminder that he is also still under authority of God. He can only act within the limitations that God has given him. He has to ask permission to do these things. And if you have read the book of Job, you can see that too. He goes to God and asks if he can do these things to Job. So here we see it again. He has asked to sift like wheat. And so if you understand that phrase, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but if you're sifting wheat, think of it like it's going in like that mesh tin and you're shaking it up so that the rest of the leaves or whatever have you, I'm not a farmer, the stuff that you don't need, so that it sifts that out. And so, okay, great, you're going to have the good stuff at the bottom, but at the same time, like you have to apply some serious pressure. You're like shaking things up for that to work. So that is going to be hard. That's going to be all the hardship that's going to come. And this is when we start to really have our faith tested. And so Jesus is giving him that heads up. Like Satan has asked to do this. He's going to shake all of you guys. He goes on to say, because Jesus knows this, but I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, strengthen your brothers. Because sometimes we will fail. Sometimes we don't come out on top. Sometimes we don't catch it in time. And so the point here is that just because you do, that doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean you can't come back to Jesus. It just means try again. Keep doing and learn from it and grow from it. And Jesus is happily taking him back in that. So he's just setting it up and explaining what this is, right? And Peter's like, yeah, Lord, I'm ready. I can go to prison for you. Like, I'll even die with you. And we'll get into what happens with Peter. But before we get to that, Jesus goes on and tells them, right, how in the past he asked them not to bring a bag, not to bring money, or an extra pair of sandals. And he's like, did you ever need anything? And they're like, no. So he's like, all right, this time I'm going to need you to do that. It says, take your money and a traveler's bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one, for the time has come for this prophecy about me to be fulfilled. He was counted among the rebels. Yes, everything written about me by the prophets will come true. So they're like, well, we have 2 swords. And he's like, that's enough. So I don't really know what he means by that's enough, but there's a note here. We'll get into that in a second. So now they're asking, Jesus telling them to be armed, be on guard, and be ready because persecution is coming. One of the notes here, Satan wanted to crush Simon Peter and the other disciples like grains of wheat. He hoped to find only chaff and blow it away. But Jesus assured Peter that his faith, although it would falter, would not be destroyed. It would be renewed, and Peter would become a powerful leader. Jesus told the disciples that one of them would betray him, and that sorrow awaited the traitor. Jesus told the disciples that one of them would betray him, and that sorrow awaited the traitor. Jesus then told Peter that he would deny that he knew Jesus. So here's the note on Jesus switching up his advice to them. It says, here Jesus reversed his earlier advice regarding how to travel. The disciples were to bring bags, money, and swords. They would be facing hatred and persecution and would need to be prepared. When Jesus said that's enough, he may have meant it was not the time to think of using swords. In either case, mention of the sword vividly communicated the trials they would soon face. Now let's jump to when Jesus goes off to pray into the Garden of Gethsemane. So he leaves the upper room and he takes his disciples, says, pray that you will not give in to temptation. Says he walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. So that's verse 41. And there's 2 things I want to look at here. One, you notice Jesus himself, knowing that this has to happen, knowing what's coming, even he is asking God, if there's any way that this doesn't need to happen or this cup can be passed, along, then this is what I would prefer. But at the same time, he's like, but if this is your will, then let it be done. Don't do what I want. Let's do what your will is. And man, this is a serious time. So it says, about a stone's throw away, he knelt down and prayed. And I don't know what a stone's throw is. And if your mind is anything like mine, I'm trying to visualize, like, was he maybe that not that far away? Because I always assumed that it was like the disciples were at the bottom of some mountain and that Jesus went all the way up to the top. And I don't know why I always assumed that. I just kind of did. So it says a stone's throw away, and I'm like, maybe it's not that far. Anyway, I looked it up and I found something really neat, and it came with a really good perspective. So I'm going to read that to you. It says, when it says Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw from the disciples is a common first century Jewish expression, not a precise measurement. It simply means a short but intentional distance. There's that word again, intentional. It's my favorite word. So far enough to be alone, but close enough to still be nearby. So practically speaking, a stone's throw is often estimated at 30 to 50 yards, about 90 to 150 feet. I don't know if that means anything to you. I know some of you are really good at telling that kind of a distance. I am not, so I'd probably have to look it up. Anyway, depending on the size of the stone and the strength of the thrower, obviously. But the point Luke is making isn't exact distance, it's relational and spiritual proximity. So this is neat. It says Jesus doesn't isolate himself completely. He steps away enough to pray privately, yet remains within reach of his friends. There's also a meaningful pastoral layer here. Jesus creates space for solitude without abandonment. In his deepest anguish, he is alone before the Father, yet still chooses nearness to his disciples. He's with both. It subtly communicates that while some battles, especially those involving surrender to God's will, must be faced personally, they are not meant to be faced in total isolation. He still had his community with him. Community is so important, you guys. We're not meant to do this alone. We're meant to have prayer warriors. Unfortunately, God's prayer warriors fell asleep, but he was still praying for them. We'll get into some of this in a second. So here he is in anguish, right? And so this angel of the Lord comes and strengthens him. Like, there's some serious stuff that's happening. He's very stressed out, right? He's thinking about everything that's about to happen. It goes, he prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood. This isn't just poetic and not meant to give much attention to. Can you imagine blood drops coming out of your skin as sweat? I didn't know that was a real thing. It is a real thing, and I'm going to read it to you. But before that, like, think of the level of anxiety or stress that he would have to be under to produce something like that. So here's what I found. It says, Jesus in Gethsemane, as being in such deep anguish about that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This has often been understood not merely as poetic language, but as a reference to a rare medical condition known as hematidrosis or hemohidrosis. In extreme cases of physical or emotional stress, the body's stress response can cause tiny blood vessels surrounding the sweat glands to rupture. When this happens, blood mixes with sweat and is excreted through the skin. Though it's rare, the condition is documented in medical literature and is most often associated with intense fear, trauma, or overwhelming psychological distress, which he was obviously under. What makes this moment especially significant is why Jesus is experiencing such anguish. In Gethsemane, he is fully aware of the suffering ahead, not only the physical brutality of crucifixion, but the spiritual weight of bearing sin and separation. He's going to be separated from his Father. You know, later on where he's like, why have you forsaken me? Well, we'll get to that in a couple days. But he knows that it's going to be absolute separation. And so this is hard. Okay, but the spiritual weight of bearing sin and separation, right? Luke, who was a physician, is the only gospel writer to include this detail, which adds credibility to the description as a physical phenomenon. The stress Jesus endured was so severe that it manifested bodily, underscoring his full humanity. At the same time, this moment reveals the depth of his obedience and love. He did not approach the cross stoically or detached, but in profound agony, choosing surrender to the Father's will even as his body bore the cost before a single nail was driven. It was like his body was already experiencing it before it happened, and he still chose to go through with it for us. I don't want to paint this picture for you. If you've seen The Passion of the Christ, that was imagery that I would never want to experience or see live ever. And The Chosen is going to probably do a wonderful job when they do their series for that too. And it's just, hard to watch, but I think it's necessary for us to remember what really went down. We paint this beautiful picture like, oh, he died and then he came up from the grave, and yeah, but like, think about everything that happened during that time, like spikes that went like into his brain, You know, like the very tree that God created was used to make a cross to crucify him. Like this is intense stuff. It's just so evil. It's so evil, but it was necessary. And he chose to do it. He took on all of it for us, for you, for me. This is serious stuff, you guys. Serious stuff that I think we take for granted far too often. And so he's sweating blood. He's sweating blood. Okay, so he gets up and he goes back to the disciples and they're all sleeping. It says that they're exhausted from grief, right? A lot of stuff is going on. It's got to be hard, but they're sleeping. So he says, "Why are you sleeping?" He says, "Get up and pray so that you will not give into temptation." Jesus knows what's coming ahead of them. The disciples they still don't really get what's about to happen. So they don't really know what he means by temptation. Like, sure, maybe break the law, maybe some pretty girl is going to try to seduce them, something like that. But this is far worse than that. And so it's just another point to make here about why prayer is so important, why it's so important to be connected to God, and to always be ready for these things. If we are not familiar with the word, we are not going to be able to stand a chance against the devil's schemes. The devil believes in God too. It's not enough to just believe in him, like you got to know what's actually true, or you're going to fall for anything. You're going to fall for those schemes. You're going to fall for those lies and the false teaching. The enemy will use anything to get you off track. He'll keep you busy. He'll keep you stressed. He'll keep you depressed. He'll do anything to keep you from being intentional about your faith. And we need to be on guard, you guys. So let me go ahead and read what's here for the notes. It says, Jesus asked the disciples to pray that they would not fall into temptation because he knew that he would soon be leaving them. Jesus also knew that they would need extra strength to face the temptation ahead, temptations to run away or to deny their relationship with him. They were about to see Jesus die. Would they still think he was the Messiah? The disciples' strongest temptation would undoubtedly be to think they had been deceived. And of course, if everything you thought Jesus was going to do, all these they didn't think that he could ever die. The Messiah can't die. He's God, but they're not understanding, right? And so all of this is just conflicting, and it would be easy to understand how someone can just be like, oh, suddenly, no, he wasn't the Messiah. I got it wrong because, now he's dead. And then that's it. It was going to be a true test of faith. Here's another note. Only Luke tells us that Jesus' sweat resembled drops of blood. Jesus was in extreme agony, but he did not give up or give in. He went ahead with the mission for which he had come. So on the sleeping part, the disciples were asleep. How tragic it is that many Christians act as though they are sound asleep when it comes to devotion to Christ and service for him. Don't be found insensitive to or unprepared for Christ's work. If you are in a country like the United States, we are so gifted in that freedom to practice whatever religion we want. There are some countries where it is illegal to be a Christian and you are put to death for something like that. I pray that we never take this for granted, that we would always be intentional and continue to see Christ and grow deeper in him.